Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zeno Staub. I serve as the CEO of Vontobel, and I have the privilege to do the introduction tonight. We're very happy to host this event together with the Asia Society, of which we are also, together with many other companies present here, a proud supporter. So the floor is yours. We are entering a discussion, and then there will also be time for Q&A from the floor. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. I hope this is on. Yeah? Okay, great. Grüezi. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here this evening. It's a couple of years in the making. I'm very, very grateful to Zeno and Herbert from Vontobel for being our hosts and for their foresight globally and with respect to Asia. And of course, the Asia Society, Nico in particular, we've been trying to find a date to have this evening take place for a couple of years now. And I know, given the size of this audience and the deep interest that you have in Asia, that it will be very, very worth it. I'm looking forward to a great conversation, especially with you, Matthias, as well. So I just wanted to kick off. Normally, the moderator should really take over, but I'm such a domineering Asian personality. I demanded to present a couple of slides. Really, just 5 minutes. A baseline of the thesis embodied in maps to give us a kind of collective understanding and point of departure about how we should see Asia. And the story could begin, actually, as Zeno did, going back centuries to kind of contrast Asia's historical arc with that of the West. But let's just, for the moment, start with exactly 30 years ago. I love it when there are historical milestones to look back at. It was 30 years ago that the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So from that time, we can look back, and everyone in this room, I see a couple of millennials and Generation Z, which is great. The rest of us can all remember where we were in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And we can remember what have been the key moments of Western history. But we don't often think about what about the rest of the world? What have been the key moments for them? What I wanted to illustrate for you here is that in the past 30 years, the most significant changes for the Asian population of the world has largely been for themselves, things that they have themselves determined and built, and they've largely been very positive things. Even the negative things, like the Asian financial crisis, have been turned into positives because they unleashed very significant incentives for reform. So one of the critical things that happened was, for example, in the 1990s, what we call the energy supercycle took off. You see to the left of the screen, the countries in pink, the Gulf countries, right? That should be called West Asia, not the Middle East, because geographically it's very much West Asia. Only Europeans would call it the Middle East, by the way, and geographers call it West Asia. So that's one of the mental transitions we have to make. Nowadays, when you go there, they see themselves as West Asian, and I write about what I call the Arab-Asian nexus that has formed. And that began in the 1990s with this commodities supercycle, this energy supercycle, where, of course, the largest consumers of West Asian energy output were growing, fast-growing East Asian markets. And that is something that has been locked in. Then you had trade liberalization. You've had infrastructure investment, the Belt and Road Initiative. All of these are chapters and milestones in the last 30 years that have brought us to this state of affairs where Asian countries trade much more with each other than with the rest of the world. So the decoupling, when we use the word decoupling today, we're talking just about US, China, and the trade war. There's a much bigger decoupling that has been baking in the system for the past 30 years, which is that Asia is becoming more and more self-sufficient. On this map, you have energy producers and energy importers. You have industrial centers and countries that have to import all of their finished goods. You have food producers, food importers. You have high-tech countries and low-tech countries. You have demographically old countries and young countries. There are enormous complementarities across Asia that have not been developed, cultivated, exploited for about 500 years. 500 years of colonialism and the Cold War came to an end in 1991. And this is one example of what Asia has been doing in just the last 30 years. They have overcome 500 years of separation in less than 25 years. That's how quickly history has returned. Now, a lot of people also look at the world and they say, when will China be number one? Will it be in the year 2029, in the year 2037? When will China have the world's largest economy? Well, if you look at economic size in purchasing power parity terms, of course, China is already the world's largest economy. But importantly, Asia, as you can see from the orange bubbles, is a multipolar region. Not only is the world multipolar, Asia is not replacing the West, right? That's not the thesis of my book, and it shouldn't be anyone's. We are actually entering an unprecedented era of history where the West remains powerful and the East is rising as well. We should think much more about the flows and fusion than the kind of notion that we have to have one unipolar center of power. That's an idea that not only we have to get used to, but even China has to get used to. China has to share Asia. And that's part of the dynamic that is underway now as well. You already have the case, you already have India, whose population is equaling that of China. It's a faster growing economy. The Southeast Asian economies actually have a larger GDP even than India taken together and are attracting more foreign investment than China. So the world is multipolar economically and geopolitically, and Asia itself is multipolar. That is just one demonstration of how complex the world is today. And when people tell you that it's zero-sum, it's winner take all, that it's only about the US and China, that's a terrible oversimplification of the genuine distribution of power in the world system. Just to make a quick point about the way Asia has evolved in the past, say, 75 years. We live in a moment right now where everything is just China, China, China. But in fact, China is only the third wave of modern Asian growth. The story of Asia's collective economic miracle begins with Japan. Of course, no one can deny that, but we forget it far too often. And the Japanese economic resurgence was an inspiration for the tiger economies. The tiger economies really are the second wave of post-war economic growth, led by Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. China at that point in time, the late 1970s, is still, quite frankly, a backwards peasant agrarian society, still reeling from the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. What brought China out of that was not only neither Xi nor Mao, Deng Xiaoping, coming to power, and of course looking at what the first two waves of prosperous Asian societies had already achieved. Looking at Japan, looking at Taiwan and Hong Kong, which are of course Chinese entities, and Singapore, which is a Chinese society, and saying, why aren't we like that? And then who were the largest investors in China? Who made China the economic superpower that we know it to be today? It didn't happen alone. The largest investors in China have, of course, been Japan and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore, right? So these are mutually reinforcing waves. And again, today people look at Asia and all they see is China, but we're already entering a fourth wave of Asian growth, driven by all of these younger countries. If you look at the countries from Pakistan through India through Southeast Asia, about a dozen countries, 2.5 billion people, right, a significantly larger aggregate population of younger demographics than China, with higher growth rates, and again, receiving so much investment from China, from Japan, from the tiger countries, right? So the wave continues and continues, and it's a mutually reinforcing process. That's the correct way to think about Asia, something that is much bigger than China, something that encompasses nearly 4.5, 5 billion people, which has all of these complementarities still to develop. Final couple of points, this is showing you the sort of Belt and Road, right? Or at least the eastern two-thirds of it. Now, I gave you a number earlier, 4.5 billion people. Just in this rectangle, which is one geometric snippet of the planet, is the majority of the world population. And it will always be the majority of the world population. So what happens here matters, quite frankly, more than in other places. And I'm trying to correct the notion that what's happening here in Europe or in the West more broadly with xenophobia and protectionism and borders and walls going up, those are not global phenomenon. But we are very guilty, whether it's in our Western press or intellectual circles, of generalizing about the world the things that are happening in what is actually now our very narrow domain. Because in the lives of the 5 billion people I'm talking about, those adjectives, those phenomena are not really what's going on, right? What's happening is more connectivity, more cross-border infrastructure investment, more trade liberalization, more cross-border migration. Those are the things that are happening here. So the agenda of globalization, of openness, all of those things are actually accelerating in Asia. And Belt and Road is one example of it. We'll have plenty of time to talk about that. Final point just about global governance. When we talk about who leads the world, we so often are looking, we challenge Asians and we say, when will you have, more votes and rights and shares in, the IMF and the World Bank? What we often missed is that Asia doesn't care about those things nearly as much as it does about building its own institutions. And two examples of that are the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is gradually taking effect, which will be the largest free trade area in the entire world. And the other is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, whose membership you see on the left. I can't actually fit all the countries that are members. It's probably the fastest growing multilateral institution in history. And it shows you how Asians are very much involved in integrating with each other, despite their rivalries, despite their tensions, despite the geopolitical volatility in the region. They are finding ways to collaborate diplomatically on the issues most important to them. And an area like infrastructure finance has been a huge deficit, a market failure, really, in global governance for about 50 years. Asia put it on the agenda. Right? And Asia is leading how it is done. And I think that's a very promising example of how we should start to witness, observe, and appreciate a transition in global governance where Asians play a very significant role. So I have about 475 other slides I could show you, but we'll limit it to those 4. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Parag. Very impressive presentation. Very warm welcome. Good evening also from my side. As Mr. Staub said, I'm head of the Asia team at NZZ. Why do we have an Asia team? We want to intensify, expand our reporting from the region. We're going to come with a new NZZ newsletter product solely with Asia stories, which we will launch probably in October. And I'm happy to be here, to have Parag as my guest here. And Parag, you made the reference to 1989, exactly 30 years ago. That was the year when I took up my East Asian studies at university. And at that time, Hong Kong still had this very good magazine called Far Eastern Economic Review.
Yes.
They had this cover story, the Asian century, it's beginning ahead of schedule. Now we're here. You have this book here, The Future is Asian, Parag.
This means it's always the future.
It's always the future.
It's never going to happen.
But then again, as you know, just a couple of years later, this discussion began about Asian values. Mahathir, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, they came up with this Asian value system, which is probably superior to our Western system. Do we still have it today, or has that changed?
It's a great question. One of the most difficult issues to tackle really is how can one generalize about the value systems, beliefs, ethos of 4.5 billion people who represent 6 or 7 major civilizational zones that have very different histories, very different political structures, the spectrum of democracies to authoritarianism. Do they have any common Asian values? And when Mahathir and Lee Kuan Yew were touting Asian values, as you know, that was the 1990s, and that was before the Asian financial crisis. Correct. So after 1998, 1999, with the Asian financial crisis, people stopped talking about Asian values. It became a euphemism for crony capitalism. Right? As I said, though, Asians spent the last 20 years recovering from that, improving their economic and governance fundamentals, becoming a lot more pragmatic, as well. So today, it is worth asking, are there a new set of Asian values? And not just for East Asian Confucianist societies, but are there certain things that all Asians have in common despite all their differences? And this is one of the key questions I try to tackle in the book. And I come up with three answers. And they're very loose, you might even say superficial, and that's fine, because the trajectory of Asia is not to be a unified supranational zone like the European Union. Right? That will never happen, and that's not the metric we should use. But can we explain aspects of Asian behavior through the lens of certain values. And I think there are three. And the first is what I call, technocratic governance, right? Even in Asian democracies, there is clearly a deference, even a bias towards, certainly a tolerance for a very strong executive branch, an executive leader. So it could be an authoritarian leader like Xi Jinping, who is popular in China to the extent that we can measure these things in China. We have, what we call elected strongmen like Modi in India or Duterte in the Philippines, who, by the way, given that they are democracies, according to public opinion surveys, you would have to admit, even if you think they are thugs, even if you think they're gangsters, you must recognize that they are the two most popular leaders on Earth today. No other two leaders on the planet have that kind of approval rating in democratic societies. So you may like it or not like it, but no one cares about your opinion or mine. Let's be absolutely clear. You must see things from their point of view. You must pretend you're a Filipino. You must pretend you're an Indian or an Indonesian if you want to properly grasp why there is this deference towards a self-proclaimed technocratic leader, someone who has a long-term vision or agenda for modernizing their country, even if they have certain illiberal traits, which I do not condone, I do not defend them. I'm trying to understand them, right? And if you were a citizen of one of those countries with a long legacy of failed governments, corruption, lack of infrastructure investment, low social spending, continued high illiteracy, you would be supporting Duterte too, right? You would. There's no question. You would be one of them, right? So technocratic governance. The other is, state capitalism, right? Mixed economics, very strong role for the state, even in countries in Asia that are nominally open political economies. This is how Japan became Japan, after all. This is how Korea became Korea. And quite frankly, that's how they still operate. So industrial policies, strong state subsidies for national champions, that's par for the course in Asia, and no one in Asia really disputes that they want to see the government play a key role in stimulating key sectors to get a leg up on competition. And the third, I'll just be very, very brief, is what I call kind of social conservatism. These are generally very conservative societies. Progress in liberalizing society is going to be incremental, almost by necessity, because they're also very diverse places that are extremely cautious and protective of their social stability. And generally speaking, you also see that even though people suffer immensely from repression, in Asian countries, whether it is women in some countries, ethnic minorities, there are human rights violations, there's lack of press freedom, there's censorship. I can criticize all of these things as well or better than any of you. I have a long catalog of complaints. I actually live in Asia. I go to countries every week. I talk to them. I tell them what I think they should do better. But you can also see things from their point of view. They're extremely, extremely insecure. So they will be conservative and cautious about the kinds of liberalism that we would, from our point of view, insist on. And again, this is common across democracies and non-democracies. So is there new Asian values? Yes. Is it something that they want to export to the rest of the world? No. I think Asians are very concerned with solving their own problems.
Yeah, but then the system, as you described it just now, Parag, with this certain set of values, technocratic government and so on, even to some European countries, it's very appealing. They say, these economies, they're growing fast with this kind of system. So does that mean that the Washington consensus as we know it is dead, is on the defensive?
So much of what helped Asia become the success story, by and large, that it's become, is actually turning to the Washington consensus that they reviled, that they feel derailed their economies, sort of removing capital controls, rapid privatization, these things. But actually, the successful Asian countries have done quite a few of those things. So, floating exchange rates, all of these kinds of things. So there's a mix of Washington consensus principles without ever using that term. I mean, if there are two words you want to use to get thrown in jail, in intellectual jail in Asia, it's Washington consensus. But they're doing it, right? And now you see a lot of countries that, even though they're fast growing, are very worried about current account deficits. They want to attract foreign capital. And so they are privatizing more and more, right? So they're doing some of those key things, but they don't want to give that credit where, because again, but it's also done with their own characteristics in mind, right? So for example, even trade liberalization, it's not free trade. there's incremental preferential trade agreements in Asia. Every country still protects certain sectors, certain companies, and so forth. And that is why they still support globalization, because they haven't had a winner-take-all, one-size-fits-all shock therapy wipeout. That's how you turn people against globalization. So if you want Asia to continue to be a place that is supportive of globalization, then you would allow them to do it in their own way.
In your book, Parag, you speak about an integrating Asia. You make the point, like from West Asia to the very Far East, from like Turkey to Japan, more or less. Is it a monolithic region? I mean, it's a very diverse region in my view. You have Muslim countries, you have autocratic systems, you have dictatorships, and so I don't really see this integration. I don't see this Asia coming together.
The most amazing thing is how, first of all, it's not the first time in history that you've had an Asian system, a zone where Asians have much more intense relations with each other than with the rest of the world. Because if that were not true before, then we would never have this phrase Silk Roads, right? The reason we have this phrase is because there were periods of time 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and 500 years ago where that was true. And it's now true again, very matter-of-factly in terms of economic ties, diplomatic coordination and cooperation. So yes, there is a convergence, a deference, definitely a tactical cooperation in day-to-day life in Asia, despite their diversity and despite their geopolitical tensions with each other. So it is very, very real. And you can actually feel it sort of on the ground every single day. The top 10 issues that consume the Asian mind, whether it is a Chinese leader or Indian or any other country, is what's happening in their country, what's happening in their neighbor's country, what's happening with China, and what are the next things they need to do to catch up with their neighbor or to integrate more, or to trade more with their neighbors. And the trade war is a very good example of this because, again, we look at it as US-China decoupling, and we don't bother with what comes next. Well, it's quite obvious. Asia will deepen its own integration. Remember that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership trade agreement was not progressing as quickly diplomatically until the US pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And in abdicating that leadership in global trade liberalization, the Asians said, well, if the US isn't going to do TPP, we're definitely going to do RCEP, right? So we often forget that others have agency, they have decision-making capacity, that they're competent, that they have foresight. And they've moved very, very quickly, actually, to deepen their integration.
Yeah, I mean, the free trade agreement took many, many years. I still remember the ASEAN, the FTA, free trade agreement in Southeast Asia. Absolutely. I mean, it's so difficult to get these countries together. The one wants to keep its rights subsidies, and the others wants to protect the car parts manufacturers.
This is not about orthodox trade theory, right? Where we've always striving for universal trade liberalization under a global kind of framework in the WTO. I think we're all past that world. Again, I love economic theory as much as the next guy, but that's not really what's happening right now. As I said, the incremental bilateral process is fine. And again, given the degree of inequality and the difference in the regulatory standards in these countries, when you're talking about the majority of the world's population and 40 countries, it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all thing. But I'm glad you mentioned, think about countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Russia. If we were sitting here 15 years ago or 20 years ago, we'd be saying, well, fine, you may say that these are geographically in Asia, but so what? They all want to join the West. Right? That's what we'd be saying about Russia, about Saudi Arabia, about Turkey 20 years ago. Fast forward to today. These are three very strategic countries, right? Three countries that you may say could go either way based on their geography. But what is the Saudi regime doing? Who are all the trade deals with, investment deals with, sovereign wealth funds, even private equity funds, in capital market activity? There's so much more activity now with Asia. There will be, like it or not, very soon, a petro RMB, right? Oil traded in RMB. Then Turkey. I think I probably don't need to tell anyone in this room, in terms of the deterioration of relations with the West. But bear in mind, Turkey is a country that now is saying it's joined the AIIB, it's receiving funds from the AIIB, as growing trade with India, telecom and rail projects with China, even talking about maybe applying to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is a NATO member state, right? Russia, of course, again, enough said. So 3 of the most significant countries that the West maybe could have, and I certainly won't blame us alone, given the types of regimes that have taken hold in those countries. If history had played out differently on both sides, these countries could have been wooed, maybe, or integrated into the West. But that is no longer going to happen, right? These countries have tilted heavily towards Asia. And that's why I actually colored them as Asian colors. And you can see it in their trade and investment data as well in terms of the growing volumes of trade each of them has with Asia, and potentially declining over time with the West.
If we talk about Asia, of course, China is the gorilla in the ring. And China dominates a lot in Asia, economically, even expanding its political influence into Southeast Asia, into the ASEAN countries. And from my experience, talking to people over there in the region, they're pretty scared about a ever becoming more stronger China there. And so is China a threat to the other countries, to the neighboring countries? Is it a chance? How should these countries deal with China?
They each have a different approach. It's very hard to generalize, because there are a number of countries, obviously, that have very large Chinese populations. There's very strong historical relations with China, where geopolitically they're not necessarily threatened by China either. And then there are those that are. But for them, it's not this sort of pendulum of 2 choices between, threat, hug, or sort of resist China. It's accommodation, because they can't change their geography. This is not the first time that China has been powerful in their historical memory. They can think about the Ming Dynasty, but they also remember that the most recent threat to them geopolitically was not China. It was Japan, right? If you think about the 20th century history and the legacy of imperialism, China is not the first thing that comes to mind. And so it's not the first to experience, if you will. So how do they manage China is the real question. And right now, things are very different, I would say, than the way we look at it. We look at it as an expansionist China can, swallow all of the pawns on the chessboard. But these are not just pawns. They actually have a lot of agency. And you can see, and I think this is where the US role is very important, the US, Japan, India, and Australia are providing a lot of support for Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam to strengthen their military capabilities, to defend their maritime claims, to strengthen their navies, to protect their own waters. And that's something that has been a significant and important warning to China. So the multilateralization of collective defense in the region is a reminder to China that it's not just a series of tit-for-tat bilateral games. There's a lot of dialogue and diplomacy going on within Asian countries to help to create certain degrees of defense. And that's just the territorial stuff. At the end of the day, even if China does, maintain its claims, as it surely will, over certain islands in the South China Sea and so forth, the key for these countries is, of course, the rite of passage, trade. These are all very trade-dependent countries, right? So for them, that's the priority. Remember that China is also very, very cautious, actually, in how it deals with a number of these countries. If you look at Belt and Road as a very important proxy for how China practices geopolitics, because China does not send battalions of troops out to conquer neighboring countries. That would be the surest path to immediate resistance. But even with Belt and Road projects, you have seen in the last several years very substantial pushback and corrections on the volume of debt, on the size of deals, on the preferential contracting, and other factors. And you've seen the pushback in Kazakhstan, you've seen it in Pakistan, you've seen it in Malaysia, you've seen it in Myanmar. And in each and every case, it's China that backs down. It's China that says, okay, fine, you want us to reduce the debt, we'll reduce the debt.
But right from the beginning, many of these Belt and Road deals and projects, they were structured so they only benefit China, or they mainly benefit China. I mean, they were structured like this, and only now, since April or something, they're making some corrections to these programs.
So I would dispute, first of all, these are countries that have massive infrastructure deficits. So it could be that the, sort of financial transactions and rather commercial benefits around contracting of the implementation of projects benefits Chinese companies that are able to execute very quickly. But it's definitely incorrect to say that the deal itself, the project itself, only benefits China. When a country has no roads or railways and they get roads and railways in 2 years built by China rather than 20 years if they built it themselves, it would be false to say that the country doesn't benefit, right? They do benefit. Now, in any case, as you also said, China has learned from the pushback. They've now had 3 years of substantial pushback. So we cannot talk about Belt and Road 2.0 the way as if it's still Belt and Road 1.0. China has made changes. And this is the beauty of geopolitics. It's so nonlinear, it's so complex, there's very rapid feedback loops. China is taking all of this feedback and realizing that it has to absorb certain additional costs to make the projects viable for the recipients, to allow them to go forward. Again, if this were the colonial age, if this were the 18th century, and if China and Belt and Road were the British East India Company, you don't really have to ask for permission. But this is not the 18th century. This is the 21st century. This is a century of sovereignty, democracy, of transparency. In every country, every citizen is watching with a microscope everything that China is doing to make sure that they get a good deal. Because all of these countries are former colonies of largely Great Britain. So there are people alive today, like my own parents, who remember colonialism. And when they see China coming, right, I can speak now on behalf of all of the people of Southeast Asian countries, of South Asian countries, the elder generation remembers colonialism. And they know what mercantilism looks like. And when China comes along and says, we have a deal for you, and it reminds them of the mercantilism that they remember, of course they're going to push back. And this is the mistake China made intellectually, to not understand the response to what it's doing from the point of view of people who have just lived through several hundred years of mercantilism.
Right? Yeah, so what I experience in the region when I travel there and talk to people, there's quite a few people who ask for a stronger US presence in the region as a counterbalance to a stronger China. And with good reason, I think.
Absolutely.
With good reason.
And it depends on the country in terms of the depth of relations. So, for example, it's ironic, the US is struggling to maintain strong relations with certain long-standing allies, like South Korea, for example, because South Korea, finds it difficult to balance between the Chinese demands and American demands. The Americans want South Korea to host theater missile defense systems, for example. It's very difficult for the South Koreans to do that without significant, negative repercussions from China. Meanwhile, there are countries like Vietnam, irony of ironies, right, that have fought the bitterest of wars of the United States, that now are hosting rotating, American naval vessels, right? So there is clearly a shift in the American posture. It's more temporary lily pads, as they like to say, and less, kind of permanent bases. Now, even if you did have equally robust U.S. military presence across the region as you had during the Cold War, which you will not have because the United States can no longer afford it and does not want to pay for it. And let's remember that that is not just a Donald Trump thing. There's a bipartisan thing, right? The size of the American military budget, or at least the deficit that results from it, is highly problematic to all Americans. So that's an issue. Then there's, of course, the need to, if they did want to, modernize and spend more and go back up to a 300-ship Navy, which is kind of the calling card in America. It's the kind of symbol of true global robustness is the 300-ship fleet. That would take a very long time. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly of all, America doesn't want to fight a war in the Pacific after the last 20 years of wars that are technically still ongoing, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the strongest resistance to defending Taiwan for the sake of it, defending the Philippines for the sake of it, being the tripwire, right, to conflict, is that American lives will be lost, American assets will be destroyed. For what price? So let's bear in mind that. Even though there are Asian powers and Asian states, both strong and weak, that very much want to see, a continued American presence there. It doesn't mean that even if it does happen, that it will be a sufficient deterrent. They have to actually learn to coalesce with each other, defend themselves, and use not just military, but also diplomatic and commercial means to deflect Chinese pressures. And that is something that they're getting very good at.
So do you think that the times when we had a coherent US policy on Asia, like Bill Clinton still had, but then came George W. Obama, he tried to re-implement it, it didn't really work. These times are over once and forever, and the US is just keeping has certain allies, 3, 4, 5 allies that it works with?
I mean, theoretically, you could sketch a coherent American grand strategy for Asia. You could say that America would, in the military domain, reinforce the kind of collective capacity of peace-loving, democratic Asian countries to defend themselves and to build an Asian security architecture that embeds China, that binds China, that doesn't allow Chinese dominance. That would be one. That it would pursue greater free trade and openness, with Asian economies so that they are tied into Western markets and technology and finance and so forth. And other elements of a kind of, again, broad spectrum, comprehensive American role. But look, in reality, that's wishful thinking right now. Again, the US pulled out of TPP. And when you ask Asians, what has America done wrong in terms of, losing its grip, if you will, on Asia? The first complaint is TPP, because Asians think more in economic terms, largely. And so that, to them, was a big sign of abdication. Now, if you had a new government in Washington tomorrow, would you have TPP passed? The answer is no, no way. Right? Obama didn't get it done. Trump rejected it right away. Even Hillary Clinton came out against it during the campaign because of the protectionist tendencies across the spectrum. And even if you did have TPP come back, or even America joined TPP, because remember, TPP exists. It just exists without America, let's not forget. After the Americans pulled out, the Canadians and the Japanese and the Chileans and the Australians were actually competing with each other to host the summits and be the leaders, right? And to take advantage of America not being there to eat into American market share. The one thing I always have to explain in Washington is that America's geopolitical allies are still its geoeconomic competitors, right? Just like America and Europe are geoeconomic competitors, right? American and European firms compete with each other across the board all over the world. Of course, we're geopolitical allies, but we're geoeconomic competitors. So for Japan and for South Korea, when they see that there are going to be less, semiconductors or other, components and goods sold to China, they say, great, it's good for them, right? So, geoeconomics and geopolitics are two very different logics.
So if we look at Washington's politics towards China, it's more or less, it comes over as the big line is we have to stop China's rise somehow, economically, technologically. Do you see a scenario where they could come back closer again and probably over a first trade deal that might be done before the elections in the US, or will this become even worse?
No, I'm not sure how much worse it will get, but it will get worse. It will not get better. And you remember there are many dimensions to the bilateral tensions. The trade war is just one of them, and the trade war is resolving itself because U.S.-China bilateral trade has dropped so low that China trades more with ASEAN than it does with the U.S. It probably isn't that far off when China trades more with Japan than it does with the U.S. So the U.S. is falling in terms of its market share of trade in Asia. Then there's obviously the military tensions. That's not going to be resolved anytime soon. Then there's the technology tensions. Obviously, there is a historical counterfactual point in time where the U.S. may have been able to build a coalition for IP protection and export controls that could have hypothetically slowed China's growing self-sufficiency in many critical technological areas. But that time is maybe 2006, So this trade war is a decade behind schedule if you really wanted to do this. And remember that you would still only be partially stemming the tide. If you make a list of the categories of goods and components, and technologies that only American firms can provide to China. It would be a very, very lucrative list, right, of chip design and certain categories, semiconductor products, so forth. But it's a much shorter list than the Trump administration thinks it is. And convincing American companies like NVIDIA, Qualcomm, Intel, that have had such a large share of their overseas revenues coming from China, that they should not continue to sell to China, not do joint ventures in China, not do joint production in China, is very, very damaging for them, especially when it comes so suddenly, and we see that in their share price. But now it is too late because, again, we can't just think about the first quarter out consequences of an action. Obviously, ZTE and Huawei can be hit, temporarily. But can they, A, accelerate their own pursuit of autonomy or autarky?
Why haven't they done it earlier?
Oh, but because they've comfortably been locked into 10-year contracts with very high-quality suppliers, from whom they have been taking IP and, in fact, doing a fair bit of their own indigenous production, which they will now accelerate so that they achieve that desired self-sufficiency sooner. For example, we know about what's happened with chips, but when it comes to Google locking Huawei out of Android, right? Part of it is very convenient for Google because, first of all, China has been a very tough market for them, needless to say, for all tech, social media companies out of the United States. But also they knew, because Huawei has announced with great fanfare, that they're going to launch their own operating system effectively as of their 2020 handsets. So why not, cut them off a little bit early and make them sort of suffer, right? It was a very low-hanging fruit for Google to comply with the US government. But on the whole, what we're seeing is an acceleration of Chinese efforts to achieve that self-sufficiency, which again does not mean that it has to be purely domestically.
Which is too late in my view. Which is too late. I mean,
too late for whom?
China, for the Chinese, to me, they are very opportunistic. It's easier to buy than develop by themselves. I mean, Ren Zhengfei has said, this could kill our company,
right?
Effectively.
And
yeah,
it will very.
They should have never become so dependent on.
Right. So
on
again, so they will switch suppliers, right?
Mm.
This will empower not only them, but it's obviously again the Taiwanese, the Japanese, the South Koreans, others that will step up and provide that to China. So of course, certain companies are going to, get hit very hard, like the ZTEs. But ZTE is not representative of the entire Chinese economy. It's certainly not representative, obviously, of some of the areas where they have become so self-sufficient that are high value added, like AI, for example, as well.
So coming back to the bigger picture, as you said, like the decoupling between the US and China, and would you agree that we're seeing a world which falls apart into small units that trade among themselves? I mean, we see protectionism rising all over the world. We see nationalism rising, and is that the scenario instead of a, as you call it, multipolar world where everybody trades with each other?
Well, those are not incompatible scenarios. A multipolar world would be one of the main reasons why you could have regional blocks and spheres of influence, right? But, however, I want to caution against the idea, which is very popular these days, that we are, sort of deglobalizing, right? Because trade is not the best metric to use in any case.
Very important.
It's an important one, but I would say that finance and capital flows are way more important. In fact, you can measure how much more important they are because trade is measured in billions and finance is measured in trillions. So I think it's lovely and cute that we obsess about the trade war every day, but maybe it's because most people are not particularly educated in economics, including journalists, but not you. You know finance.
You how to write a good economic story, Parag, yeah.
But present company excluded, the general public, is not very well educated. So, they want to focus on the number of containers on Maersk ships that are floating around the seas and whether those volumes have increased or decreased. What do they understand about bond markets, right? Or about equity markets, and understanding the ways in which capital account liberalization and the opening of Chinese equity markets to foreign capital inflows from the less than $500 billion today to 2 or 3 trillion, that is countless times more important for globalization than who is providing your t-shirt, right? I mean, think about this for just a second. And I can't think of a single Western asset manager, those that control the trillions, that doesn't want greater access to Chinese capital markets. We are in Switzerland, let's not forget, all of my Swiss friends here, who sit on top of these trillions. But
did you hear that? Yeah, sitting on top of these trillions.
What China is doing, I mean, when I think about the global institutional investment community, and you think about the 50, 60 trillion dollars of, kind of disposable or certainly allocatable capital out there in savings, that the U.S. controls some share of, and it's not the U.S. government, right? It's BlackRock, and it's Fidelity, and it's Vanguard, and these are all following the lead of J.P. Morgan and MSCI, who are including Chinese mainland shares now into their indices, and there is an appetite, obviously, to go in and get that yield. And remember that what China is doing today is what Japan and Korea have already done. Right? You already have Japan and Korea in your retirement portfolios. Now you're going to have China in your retirement portfolio. And what China is doing, again, consistent with what I was saying, first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave, the Indians and the Indonesians and Thailand, they're saying, we want to do that too. We want to bring in this portfolio capital. We want our companies to be capitalized. We want to have more liquidity in our exchanges. And they're going to do that too. And that is, again, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that has already begun to flow from west to east in terms of these capital flows.
Especially into China, not so much in other emerging markets.
No, again,
Asia.
China
especially in
will
China
take
because of the MSCI and the bond index
exactly.
includes China.
And
now,
again,
so.
they're just beginning to fumble with this. China has talked about doing these things for more than 10 years, and it's been very, very slow in doing so, some of which is a result of the need to respond to the financial crisis and the capital controls that, once again, in some ways are quite strong if you look at what, how they try to manage their currency and so forth. But it is, yes, inevitable. As they move towards a current account deficit situation, as they want to see, greater foreign participation in their bond markets and so forth, it is inevitable. So look just a couple of years ahead, and you have a lot more of the categories of globalization that matter, again, a lot more. I mean, if we're going to have 3D printing making stuff everywhere, inevitably you're not going to need to make certain things in certain places and send them elsewhere. That's one sliver of what globalization really is, and not the most important one.
I agree with you, Parag. China wants to be integrated into the global financial system. They know they have to keep their growth, their economy growing strongly, right? But one last question about the US, about the China-US relationship before we come to Europe. With this rise in Asia that we see, rising economies, growing economies, and the relationship between the US and China, can the US somehow profit from Asia's rise or not anymore?
It already has. It only requires a non-Trumpian, sort of logic.
Okay.
Look, I mean, global financial and economic accounting cannot be reduced to the dollars and cents of today's snapshot of the trade deficit. That is ridiculous, right? No serious economist on the planet Earth thinks that way. That's why no serious economist works for Donald Trump. We have more than 40 or 50 years of the United States benefiting massively from the rise of Asia, just from exports, just from the cost savings from lower cost production. All of these things are undeniably quantifiable gains.
But is that changing now? With a new order, is that changing? Are these times over? China financing the US?
Well, China doesn't have to recycle its, savings into American treasuries as much anymore, and it's not going to. Actually, part of what is happening with the trade war is that because exports to the United States by China are the largest source of US dollar inflows into China, that's inevitably going to shrink. But of course, as they open the capital account further, you'll have that offset pretty substantially. So there's a number of things going on there in terms of can the U.S. benefit, but the U.S. still benefits, of course. And again, you're only looking at certain aspects of economics, right? Not even the full economic picture, right? In terms of if we really want to do a proper accounting, the United States still benefits tremendously. And let's remember that this is not just about how many cars, American cars, are sold in Asia. That's so insignificant in terms of the revenues. If you look at technology companies, which are really what the American economy is about today, American technology companies love Asia. They're building more fiber optic cables across the Pacific. Their revenues are growing double digits every single year. Their headcount in Asia is growing massively. Their revenues for their B2B, B2C products, data centers, everything are going through the roof. So corporate America wants TPP. Corporate America actually loves the Belt and Road Initiative because they would love to be contracting more into it, which is certainly something that Europe is going to do more successfully. So corporate America and the American citizenry has benefited massively. Look at obviously the demographic inflows, right? The flows of Asians. The largest number of net new American citizens every single year are not Latinos, Asians. Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese. Look at the CEO of, half of the Silicon Valley companies. As you know, they are Indian, right? Or Iranian or Chinese, right? So there's no question, that the talent pool from the economics to the talent, in every which way, America has benefited from China's rise. There's something called the elephant curve, which you can see, just a very, very small sort of segment of the American society, which is basically industrial automotive workers in the Great Lakes region, have been the losers in terms of their, very flat wage growth due to global trade in the last several decades. And the fault for them not being transitioned to higher value jobs and higher wage jobs, that fault does not lie with China. Right, it lies with Washington, right, sure. With not investing in trade adjustment assistance, the kind of policies for worker retraining that all European countries have, and America has been foolish not to do.
So in your book, you make the point that Europe could profit more from Asia's rise than America. Why is that?
Yeah, and let's be clear: Asia today, Europe today, trades much more with Asia than it does with the United States. To be absolutely clear. We all grew up as the, sort of in the transatlantic era, right? Even I did, right? And that era is gone economically in terms of trade. If you want to focus on trade, there's no better evidence that we are already in a Eurasian sort of era, right? Europe trades $500 billion a year more with Asia. And of course, that is going to grow significantly because you have an FTA with Japan now. You are pushing for an FTA. The EU is not you, Switzerland, obviously, but Europe as a whole. FTA pushing for that with ASEAN, with India, trying to pry open China's economy, try and gain greater market access. And then there's the Belt and Road Initiative and all of the growth from all of the economies in the region in terms of every country in between Europe and Asia. So Europe already is very well positioned, to benefit from the rise of Asia. But of course, we haven't had to really, think about Asia has not been thought of as so near, and that's, I think, the awakening that is happening here in the region. I think overall it's a positive thing. Rather than practice the kind of, fear-mongering, right, that one has in the U.S., I think you're being here a lot more cautious. America is making its policies with an axe, and here your investment screening and other kinds of measures are being done with a scalpel, in a much more surgical and nuanced way. And that's probably a good thing, and that's probably the more democratic way of going about it as well. So every European country, and Europe as a whole with the EU-Asia kind of connectivity theme, and joint efforts at investment screening with respect to China and common negotiation on these FTAs. These are all examples, very pivotal examples of a collective European effort to have a proactive Asia strategy. And I personally think that even if Europe tends to maybe be late, to the game, it comes around in a very sort of, in a very meaningful way.
But almost every country in Europe in a different way and with a different attitude, I think. I mean, if you take Southeast European countries, they're much more attracted to like the China or the China model, if we would want to call it like that. And there's other countries like Germany, for example, since 2 years, they've become very, very prudent now in dealing with China and Chinese investment and so on. So there's almost in every country a different attitude.
And that's fine. And, European success today in many international theaters is the result of the kind of sum total of what individual European countries have done. And that's fine. Not everything has to be top down. You know, every region of the world has great difficulties in integrating and harmonizing, especially things like foreign policy or migration policy. So this is a debate, as you know, really goes back to the 1970s. You know, how unified and unilateral can Europe behave, and if it doesn't, it will fail. Well, obviously, that's not true. You know, you can have 50 European foreign policies, and they can all add up to collective European benefits.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be more effective if they would have one
maybe
comprehensive
the answer is just maybe.
Asia strategy?
No, and because that will never happen, it's almost pointless to discuss it. You know, you and I live in the real world, and in the real world, if if the Swiss banks help to open up Chinese financial markets, that opens the door to other European financial institutions. Why not? What's wrong with that, right? How long would you have to wait? You don't even have, a banking union in Europe yet. Would you want to wait for there to be a banking union, for there to be a common banking foreign policy with respect to China or Asia? Of course not. So deal with reality as it is, and that's what I think is happening. And if you look at Italy's policy on Belt and Road, which was very controversial from a German or French point of view, really what the Italians are saying is, wait a minute, Germany already has such huge trade with China and Asia. France too, way more than we Italians. We want to get our slice of this pie. So we're going to go around you and join Belt and Road. And that was part of their logic. And I think they're entitled to that. Basically, every European country is kind of waking up and realizing that they have to be more German. I mean, they have to focus on exports, right? They have to, if you look at Germany since 2008, its ability to shift its export geography, away from slow growth European neighbors towards higher growth markets, that's what the rest of Europe is saying they also need to do. So I don't fault the Italians at all for joining Belt and Road. Now, again, from the Berlin point of view, they've broken rank. They haven't stuck with a common European position that is critical of China. It's easy to say when you're a rich country that receives the soon-to-be larger share of foreign investment from China, right? But it's actually quite hypocritical.
Yeah, but in a certain way, you have to somehow find a way, a comprehensive, coherent way, dealing with a more and more assertive China. Don't you think so?
Sure. And, I think that part of the response would actually be for more European countries to join Belt and Road and to get inside that Chinese tent where the deals are being made and to dilute Chinese dominance of the procurement and contracting over those projects. You cannot do it from the outside. You cannot water down a Chinese multilateral initiative unless you are a member of that initiative and steal your share from them. And so I actually think that even though it seems like one would be kowtowing to China, the history of diplomacy suggests that the way you actually water down another's influence is by joining their club. That's what Chinese membership in the WTO did, right? Weaken the sort of stringency of the rules and take the benefits, right? And so you could actually the West can do the same thing to China that China did to Western multilateral institutions. The principle at play is around how you negotiate in diplomatic sort of constellations, not something that depends on whether the leader is China or America. This is just how diplomacy works.
Talking about technology and comparing Europe to Asia, I mean, we're seeing all these new tech companies in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN countries, as well as in China, the Alibabas, the Tencents, the Baidus. Europe is traditional. Switzerland, Germany, very good at machinery, combustion engine cars, and so on. So is there a real danger that we are being overtaken by Asia, especially China? If then, what should be done right now? What would be the next steps?
So, the analysis, I'm not sure if it should be as sort of existential and kind of, threaten, we don't have enough unicorns, we don't have enough trillion-dollar companies here, we're not investing enough in national champions. That analysis that's clearly what the European consensus has become. And therefore, you have, what has been articulated in just the last couple of weeks, these proposals that Europe will cede these mega funds to capitalize European champions in various industries and become, more globally competitive and so forth. It may work, it may not. It certainly is not guaranteed to work when it comes to stimulating innovation. You can't just, wave a magic wand over a hat and out pops the rabbit. I remember when there was a talk in Europe about seeding a European Google. Well, how far did that get? Right. Instead, it's what does Trump call Margaret Vestager, the tax lady? The tax lady who hates America. Right. So instead of you haven't created your own European Google. You've just decided to fine Google tens of billions of dollars, and that's your way of doing it. But it will probably work when it comes to export credits. Right. At the end of the day, Europe still does have such a significant and what should be a great source of confidence share of the critical, firms that can deliver the key things that Asian countries really need in terms of their modernization, their supply chains, their industries, and so forth, building smart cities and so forth. That's why one sees, whether it is Siemens and SAP and others, they're also performing well in Asia, and there's a lot more to be done. If you look at just some of the recent deals that China has struck around, or not just China, but Asian countries around LNG and infrastructure, and energy sector development there with European partners, right? Whether it's Eni from Italy, Total, others. So there's a lot that Europe, again, will do, going back to the previous point about that cooperation. So I think export control, export credits, will be a critical thing, because this is a world where export credit agencies are highly competitive with each other, and Europe, that already has strength in that area, if you double down on that, I think that will really help increase European market share across Eurasia, and that will obviously be a great thing for European, sort of stimulus.
Before we come to the question session, Parag, I want to ask you one or two questions about your home country, India. I've always loved reporting from India, a tremendously interesting country, and we've seen the Modi government being re-elected, having been re-elected this year, and the economy is slowing down. What are the most urgent reforms now that should be tackled and to get growth up again?
India, like most Asian countries today, its problems are largely self-inflicted, right? Slow pace of reform, corruption, bureaucratic entanglement, this kind of thing. Lack of professionalism at the top levels, and so forth. And so there's a long list, in India. In no particular order, job creation, right? One of the things that's disrupting India right now, including worldwide, obviously, is labor automation. So the Modi administration has the right agenda. Of course, any leader in India would say we need to create 4 million jobs a year, but they're at a much lower pace than that right now, probably only 1 million. And automation is obviously not helping, right? Infrastructure investment needs to kick in much more actively. Now, India has, and Modi has done this like no other leader in terms of the share of the federal budget going to infrastructure is massive, right? But it could be even more. It could be faster. They have to obviously deal with environmental crisis. We're seeing water running out. We're seeing air pollution is terrible. That has, very negative effects on productivity. So a very proactive approach is needed there. There have been, tax reforms, bankruptcy reforms, but, investment regulation has not clearly been sufficiently reformed to attract the volume of capital that India should be attracting. They have to stabilize the currency, which they now sort of have, but it became so weak that it's obviously hurt consumer confidence, spending, savings rates. All of these things have been terribly hurt by the mismanagement
Doesn't sound
of
very
the
optimistic.
currency.
Doesn't sound very optimistic.
Again, the bigger the country, I like to say that, I used to say like 10 years ago, every problem in China is the biggest problem in human history, right? And it was kind of logically true, given the size of the country. Now you can almost say every problem in India is like the biggest problem in human history, because there's the difference obviously being, China is China. There's only one China in terms of that just, relentless focus that they have. And when I started going to China, much later than you. Actually, just me, only in the last 20 years I've been going. You've been going even longer. But I go to China and have been going to China now for 20 years constantly with a very long list of worries and complaints and accusations and what are you going to do about your aging, your economy, your environmental problems and political unrest and all these things. But in China, they always have an answer. And they're working on it. They're really actually doing it. You may not like what they're doing, but they're doing it. Obviously, with democratic India, things are going to take longer. You can see them copying China in some ways, saying, we're going to have more special economic zones. We're going to have a Make in India industrial policy. We are going to take the failed kind of failing, highly indebted, toxic kind of state-owned banks and escrow them in a kind of SASAC type thing like what China has. So they'll do these things, but the reforms and the restructuring is of course going to take longer. And that's again, it's India's own loss because like I say, India is just getting in its own way. The whole world wants to do more business in India.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
We want a strong India.
Right.
But 20 years ago, we were writing already, India is like an airplane on the runway with the engines running full speed, but it doesn't take off.
Oh, we have 20 years of analogies like that. That's a good one, though.
Sorry. Okay, I think now we've got like 15 minutes for your questions, ladies and gentlemen. There should be 2 microphones in the room somewhere here. I want you to wait until the microphone has come to you because the whole session is being recorded. Second thing is, please keep your questions short and actually make it real questions so many people have the chance to ask. There's one gentleman in the very back there having the microphone, please.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity, Mr. Parag. Two questions. One, the futurization, you say, what are the 3 or 4 events that could derail this future? That's one. And the second is, you mentioned about the Ming dynasty, and the analogy that I draw is China is becoming self-sufficient like it was in the Ming dynasty, and then it went shut. It sort of shut off from the world, and it led to colonialism and many other things. Is there a chance that China could want to repeat that? Mm-hmm. Because they've got everything that they need. They don't need really stuff from the rest of the world.
Great question.
Thanks.
Questions. So on the first one, look, I mean, to be honest, the present is Asian in so many ways, right? Half the world population, half the GDP. How can one say that will reverse or that Asia will collapse? Asia is too big to, talk about as if one thing can bring it down, right? We see that even a deceleration of China, has a certain knock-on effect for countries that are heavily dependent on exports to China. But there's also enormous domestic growth and other cross-border linkages and investment inflows that are keeping those countries going. So, and when it comes to conflict, right? If you had a war, North Korea, South China Sea, India, Pakistan, India, China, remember that Asia is not like Europe, where every local conflict is simultaneously becomes a regional conflict, either because of its scale or because of alliance relationships and escalation effects. Those things don't happen in Asia. Asia is very big, right? If you have a war between India and Pakistan, if you have a war in the South China Sea, it probably stays where it is. It doesn't ricochet through automatic alliance relationships into a war that engulfs all of Asia. No such thing has ever happened or will ever happen. So there isn't one thing that, takes down Asia. Again, Asians' biggest problems are their own self-inflicted problems. They have to learn to work through it themselves. And a country can harm itself, but it is, not really doing as much harm to others as it may think it's doing, so to speak, if it tries to. Now, in terms of the Ming Dynasty, I mean, for China, it's very clear. The lesson from that episode is not to make the same mistake, not to close up, not to turn inward, not to give up the advantages that it's building in the Indian Ocean, and so forth. And so that's what history is there for, to learn from, not to repeat the same mistakes. And I think that that's something I address in the book when I look at how Asians view the period of Western dominance. They view it as an accidental byproduct of their own mistakes, rather than as the result of genius and ingenuity. And if you look at, I can't do justice to it in the book, though I have passages about it, but if you think about the flow of technologies and maritime navigation and gunpowder and so forth from east to west, and then, China retreating and almost giving up these advantages to countries that then took advantage of them from the West to conquer the East, they say, that was really silly. We're not going to make that mistake again. So, I could go into much more detail. There are other significant historical episodes that mean a lot to Asians in terms of mistakes they don't want to repeat. And because they are very mindful of history, it's a safe bet that they're not going to commit those same mistakes again.
There's one question there.
Thank you very much for underlining the importance of the financial system and the investment activity. I think that's really crucial as well nowadays. You also mentioned that China is interested in opening up its financial system and liberalize its current account, etc. So from all what you said, I surmise that you are foreseeing a more multilateral financial system, which is completely in contrast with today's financial system, which is dominated by the US dollar. How do you foresee a transition from today's financial system into this multilateral financial system?
It's a good question. I think over the last 10 or 15 years, there have been periods where we started to see either a shift in composition of reserves, where the euro took on a stronger role prior to the financial crisis, but then of course there was a flight back to the dollar. And of course, in terms of bilateral trade settlement, where China is making, or has been making steady progress in compelling some of its largest trading partners. No, it's not significant yet, and it may not be, right? But I think that there are signal moments, such as again a petro RMB, which again it's hard to deny is almost an inevitable fact when you think about who West Asian countries depend on for their energy exports. So I don't see a shift, first of all, a lot of people want to posit the opposite extreme, right? Which is that you move towards a kind of China-centric RMB world. I think nothing of the sort is going to happen whatsoever. I think of the US dollar as a, by and large, liquid utility, that generally has served everyone's interests quite well, but only if it continues to be managed in that way. And because there are serious concerns about the politicization and weaponization of the US financial system, that does incentivize countries to try to find ways to multilateralize or multipolarize or create pockets of openness for themselves. And you can see, it's failed so far. You're absolutely right. And that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, right? If you think about the ways in which the trade volumes have shifted so significantly away from the US, and the ways in which, whether it's the modifications in the financial system that Europe would like to bring about and that China would like to bring about, the way in which they're managing now to hold sovereign debt, and shift away or have greater share of their reserves and their borrowing in their own currencies. Therefore, it diminishes the need to hold as many dollars as before. These are all pretty big shifts. I mean, if you think about very seminal events in the kind of global, monetary and financial order of the last 10, 15 years, one cannot discount how important it has been that countries are borrowing more in their own local currencies now than in dollars, right? I mean, if you think about just a relatively recent history where emerging markets wouldn't have any credibility unless they borrowed in dollars, that's changed a lot, right? When Asian economies, Asian emerging markets can issue 20, 30-year bonds in their own currencies, and there's a strong market for it, that shifts the necessity of holding dollars as much as in the past. So, and again, if, given what's the US fiscal position and where interest rates may go, again, I'm not saying there'll be a wholesale shift from one to the other. I'm simply saying that the gradual process of diversification that was underway before 2008 can logically resume. I'm not making an argument for how long it will take or what its end state is, but I certainly think that it can be a steady process that doesn't, that does move in a more multilateral direction. There's no reason for it not to.
Who has the microphone? There's one question here. This gentleman has been asking for quite some time already. Yeah.
Thank you. How do you think China's going to deal with Hong Kong? Are they going to mess that up?
Oh, we've been waiting for this one.
That would have been my last question.
I was in I go to Hong Kong a lot. I was there yesterday, literally, and I hear very, very pessimistic things about the kind of long-term prognosis. I mean, are they going to mess it up? I mean, from our point of view, they've already messed it up, right? There isn't any doubt about that. Again, history could have played out so differently. If the ways in which leaders, whether it's in Beijing or in Hong Kong itself, if they were less, say, tone deaf or more inclusive in their thinking, or thought about these scenarios in a multi-step kind of way, they might have made different decisions. But we are where we are, and they've been doing death by 1,000 cuts for more than 20 years, right? And it's going to continue, one way or the other. So, are they going to get what they want, which may be a shifting target, but are they sort of cleansing in some ways various opposition individuals? Are they pushing out non-mainland friendly business leaders? Look what they're doing in real estate and financial markets right now, tanking the market so they can buy everything cheap, and come in over time. And the number of mainland Chinese who have moved into China in the last 20 years totals more than 1 million people. So you don't actually have a unified Hong Kong, sort of independence movement. So the further out into the future you look, the more it looks like, a fairly futile kind of situation. And of course, you'll have Hong Kongers themselves leave. This is the other thing.
The lady in the middle there. Yeah.
I have a question on the weakening world economic cycle. We are seeing massive problems in India. You mentioned them, with capital flight from India from rich people. Also China with slower growth. And China is trading more with Europe. There are signs of a recession in Germany, the engine, the motor of the European economy. So my question is, what will the impact of stagnation, a world stagnation with recession in some important parts, be on the capital flow that is going to Asia right now?
It's a good question. I mean, it would be too strong to speak of global stagnation, right? I mean, we're seeing obviously the strongest term that one would use is a kind of synchronized slowdown or deceleration, right? Because remember that Asian countries are still growing really rapidly and substantially, right? You will certainly have more regionalization of financial flows. We already see that happening with the opening of markets. We see this with outbound capital out of Singapore. We see this with the asset managers in Asia directing more capital intra-regionally. We still see, when you think whether or not there's a slowdown of growth in the US or in Europe or in Canada, you still have the institutional investment community of Western societies increasing their focus on Asia because they still have the outstanding pension liabilities and obligations that are something, correct me anyone in the room, something like $70 trillion, right? So they have to think about the next 10, 20, 30 years, and they have to look for those returns. So what I see every single day in a place like Singapore is Canadians, Norwegians, Germans, everyone is coming and opening their offices in Singapore to have as a base to look for higher yield opportunities for investment. Because even if you have what you're positing as a sort of global stagnation, you still have to generate returns somewhere, and you're more likely to get them, obviously, out of Asian markets right now. And so again, if you're planning for the future, you still have to be looking at increasing your allocation to Asia.
Thank you.
Next question, the lady in the front row here, please.
First, thank you very much for your insightful speech. I like your book very much. You mentioned about the Washington consensus. I'm very happy to hear, but you just very quickly mentioned it. You said that China actually integrated the Washington consensus with Beijing consensus that create a miracle. but how about we bring Beijing consensus to the West, make a miracle again? What do you think? And how would the West learn from the East?
I don't think that there is Beijing consensus that's articulated in terms of 5 principles of the Beijing consensus that apply to China and Asian countries that is a packaged prescription to be exported, right? I don't think any such thing exists. I think there are lessons. I cited at the end, for example, infrastructure finance, right? The infrastructure finance deficit is a Western market failure that Asian countries have concretely addressed through their own investments and institutions, and it's now become a global priority. And you see Western countries like the United States and Europe saying that, we want to launch, for example, the U.S. has launched a U.S. International Finance and Development Corporation, right? The EU has launched the Asia Connectivity Initiative. Japan and India have launched their connectivity corridors. Everyone wants to compete with Belt and Road now because China has really put front and center on the agenda how important infrastructure finance is. So that's an example of a kind of thought leadership and a diplomatic initiative that others are now copying and responding to. So that you could say is sort of like a Beijing consensus kind of thing. But there are a lot of things that you would that one could say are attributes of sort of Chinese model state capitalism and so forth that aren't necessarily Chinese, right? I mean, there's so much about the mixed capitalist approach to markets and mercantilism generally, that's purely European inventions, right? That Asia has borrowed. And when it comes to the strong support for national champions, again, China saw this in Japan and Korea. It didn't need to invent, sort of the idea. So much of what China does today is actually taken from the Japanese and Korean playbook, actually. So I think of the flow of ideas, if you think about each category of policy as being something that's much more diffuse than, a pure indigenous kind of invention. But again, around the world, are there things that, when countries look at China, they say, we need to do this, we need to learn from this. And they do so even if they're democratic countries and have very different histories. And again, I've cited a lot of them, special economic zones, industrial policies, more R&D investment, all of these things. Countries around the world, look to China and see what China has achieved in a short period of time, admire it, and try to copy elements of it. And that is exactly how ideas spread. From successful models of what Japan has already done, what Europe has already done, what China has learned from and done, and then those lessons spread to other countries. It's not a Beijing thing or a Washington thing. It's a continuous circulation of, what is the menu of options that my country, whatever my country is, what can I do, what can I afford to do, what can I get away with doing, and then you do it.
Okay, next question. There's one man in the third but last row, I think. Yeah, the hand there.
I have 2 questions. One question as an investor, where would you put your money, in American Alphabet or in Chinese Baidu? And the second question is, the carbon footprint of Switzerland is 0.5% of the global GDP. China has 20%. Do you think China have a chance to reduce it? That we can manage the probably biggest crisis we'll all face, the climate crisis?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. Answer the first question, Alphabet. No question about it. Very diversified, conglomerate of very innovative companies, and obviously you're much more, liquidity in that investment. So, needless to say, I would go with that. But in terms of China's carbon footprint, I mean, 2 things. The first is that China's carbon footprint is also the world's carbon footprint. If you are a company that manufactures in China, you are responsible for part of China's carbon footprint. And this is very critical to understand, that you should not measure emissions by national boundaries, but through supply chains, right? So if, like I just said, with, outsourcing and manufacturing, but what is China doing to reduce its emissions? Obviously, huge investments in nuclear energy, solar, wind, hydro, the whole spectrum of alternatives and renewables. Of course, it's still building, unfortunately, a lot of coal-fired power plants. It's exporting coal power plants to other countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, and others. So it's a mixed bag in terms of what China is doing. But bear in mind that a lot of China's efforts are quite genuine. They have a lot of stranded oil assets now on their books as a result of the success of the energy transition in a number of provinces. So what is the time point at which they are at a very steady, when they pass the inflection point and you really start to see a significant reduction in emissions, and even a movement towards the kind of grid parity that some European countries have? That's obviously a long way off, but you're talking about a massive economy that still has a huge amount of industrial output. But, I think that by and large, it's fair to say that they're trying very hard in making huge investments in this area. So, again, they're working at it, right, in terms of reducing emissions. But, sadly, right, it's not enough in terms of the overall global carbon footprint, right? In so many ways, we're past the point of no return. It doesn't mean that China shouldn't, continue to make its best efforts, and India and Indonesia and everyone else also, the US most of all. But I don't think that that's going to be the solution at this point.
So as time is almost up, I would suggest we collect 3 very brief questions. This gentleman has been raising his hand for quite some time already. There's a lady in the middle there raising her hand, and in the very last row, I think, or second but last row. Yeah, you. Yeah. Please keep them short. And
thanks, Prag. That was great.
Very briefly.
So, quick question about all the Western companies look at Asia as a cheap source of labor, cheap manufacturing, and now a huge market opportunity, right? Why don't they look at this as an innovation hub? And what should Asia do to change its perception from a cheap to an innovation hub?
Right. Okay.
Thank you. Second question. Yeah.
My question was referring to the Asian values you mentioned, technocracy and state-led capitalism. Will that be an impediment to development of the economy, keeping China but also other Asian countries from reaching sort of the stage where we are at in Europe and the United States in terms of innovation and high levels of high living standards? Or will they always stay in that middle income state?
Third one, the lady there, and then we conclude it.
Thank you very much for very informative information. Since I was a little girl, I always believed that the future is in Asia, and today you have confirmed it. Asia is obviously full of opportunities, but there's also a lot of challenges. Since 10 years ago, I've been working for a European company invest in Asia, and I'm still learning about all these challenges. So I would be very happy to hear your point of view about the challenges of making business in Asia from a European point of view.
Well, maybe in reverse order. I mean, for Western companies in general, obviously, navigating regulations, competing with locals, finding talent is one of the significant complaints, or difficulties as well. So all of the above, it's still a long list. In fact, European companies that have succeeded in Asia, sort of despite all of these burdens and barriers that still exist. And Asian countries want to bring those down for the sake of their own improvement, so they can unlock, and this is the second question really, so they can unlock or overcome the bottlenecks or impediments to their growth. But one of those bottlenecks is not sort of necessarily kind of their form of government, right? Because the truth is that if you run, historical correlations of the factors that enable growth, rule of law will matter more than whether or not you're a democracy, right? So they want to make improvements in rule of law, even if they don't necessarily want to become more democratic. And whether or not they become a middle-income country is determined now in many ways more by how they cope with the transition towards a services economy and cope with labor automation than whether or not they're democracy or non-democracy. So these things are highly, highly complex, with many variables. But I think that it's really about, rule of law and coping with technology disruptions and managing urbanization and education so you have a services economy with higher wages. And that can be a more innovative place, to your question, because actually, I profile a number of companies in the book that do view Asia as innovation hubs. I look at Dyson, for example, out of the UK. Not only has Dyson been investing in Asia in manufacturing and production in a kind of low cost arbitrage kind of way, but designing products for the Asian market in Asia with Asian input. And now, of course, James Dyson himself, as ironically some would say, as someone who supported Brexit, has physically moved to Singapore, and sort of offshored himself. But his company has been doing significant investments, and they talk about everything from their home care products and so forth to being things that have been designed through Asian innovation. If you look at now mobile handsets and so forth, Asians think that Huawei's and Samsung's are much better than Apple iPhones. A millennial Asian today, and this is why Apple's market share is declining so substantially in Asia, their first preference, not because it's cheaper, it's genuinely a better product, right? It's waterproof, its cameras are better, higher resolution, battery life is longer, all these other things. Apple is actually catching up, right? So I think that, there are many areas, where you have pretty significant indigenous Asian innovation. It's been Japanese, now Chinese, Korean, distributed, and you'll have more of it over time. Again, it doesn't have to come purely from within, right? It can come from forced technology transfer, right, and other kinds of things. If you think about, the electric car market has taken off in China, BYD and others. They've obviously borrowed initially foreign technologies. Chinese rail cars. Now, Chinese have some of the fastest trains in the world. They didn't invent the technology, but they've innovated upon it and applied it to their markets. And technically, the definition of innovation is not inventing something, right? There are two different words, invention, innovation. Innovation is, did I harness it? Did I run with it? Did I commercialize it? Did I adapt it to the large customer base that is my own country? And so in that sense, Asians have been massively innovative.
Okay, I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your interest, for your questions here. Very interesting questions.
Me too.
Great, and I want to thank Parag for his valuable insights. Very impressive, Parag. I must say, as a journalist, I was really impressed by you, and I'm already looking forward, Parag, sitting together with you in 30 years, probably. We'll be old and gray and probably look back to 2019 and say, yes, we were right.
I hope so.
Yeah, Parag, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Danke.
Thank you.